So another year, so we have a lot on our plate this year. A couple of good things. First, as part of the program updates, is that the budget has been looking pretty good, is good. So we don't see any significant problems there as we're moving ahead. Kind of related to that is hiring, and we are in the process of adding, well, DEP-wide, we're trying to bring people on. We have some additional resources in terms of money in the budget. We got, and up here we'll be able to retain. So we're hiring that. We do have a couple of limitations when it comes to hiring. One is money. The other is that there's a cap on the number of bodies that we can actually have, and the two don't necessarily jive. So it's, as we move ahead and people are retiring, as you've heard about before and you'll continue to hear about, and the backfilling becomes a little bit of it's not simply, oh, somebody's leaving, we can easily backfill them. There is a process to go through, given the number of vacancies in the department, which ones become the priority at any given time. So if there seems to be kind of delays in hiring, and believe me, there seems to be delays, part of it is figuring out kind of how to fill the positions we have with the people that we needed, not just within wayside cleanup, but giving thought all across the department. And wayside cleanup, we do tend to focus a lot on the regional work that's done. The ER staff and the auditors, the site management staff and everybody out there, because that's where the boots on the ground are. And we within wayside cleanup in Boston have some vacancies that we're trying to fill, and we're hiring, doing greater interviews now. We expect some more coming in the future. So all of which to say, I'm going to be begging you to apply to us for some positions in the very near future. Well, maybe not all of you, but many of you. And some interesting, challenging things that are coming up for the new year. We're going to be doing a lot of PFAS work, for example, in the new year. And I'm not going to steal any of the thunder about talking about what we're doing in the regs. But in general, there is a proposal from the legislature to provide some additional funding to DEP to do PFAS testing, particularly to assist municipalities, public water supplies, looking at PFAS. And so we're planning on how to do that. And the testing, the sampling and the analysis is really the easy part of that, although it will chew up a lot of the money. The hard part is planning for the response, what comes next, how one deals with the water supplies. We've had a steady trickle of these coming in over the last 6 months to a year as water supplies have voluntarily been testing, or other states have been testing and having that testing affect us in Massachusetts. There's a bottled water issue that had come up, that came out as a result of the state of New Hampshire testing. So there's a lot going on there. We're continuing to coordinate with the Office of Research and Standards and the Drinking Water Program, and the regional offices are, I think pretty much all 4 of them now are deeply involved in PFAS. So that will be continuing. What else for updates? And the regs, there's a lot to talk about on the regs. We just talked about that too. Yeah. And Liz is whispering, tax. That's what I keep hearing, and it confuses me, but what she actually meant is TAGs, Technical Assistance Grants. So part of the discussions that we had last spring, and part of the comments that we received reg package, went to the question of, is DEP ever going to restore the technical assistance grants that we've had in the past? And part of the answer is, well, we need people for that. And the good news is that's one of the positions that will be posted in the very near future are what some of you may think of, certainly we think of as the Susan President position. Working with the LSPA and working with the LSPs on training as part of that. But another piece of the work that that person will be doing, we hope to have them administering the technical assistance grants as well. So the timing will depend on how quickly we can get that person on, but that should be over the next 4 to 6 months, you know, given the vagaries of how the hiring process works. But it's one of the things we can do in response to the discussions and the comments of the regs that don't need a reg change. We just need the bodies and resources to actually do it. We have the money. We can do it with the additional staffing. And as we step up, we hope to get that rolling. I think that's good. Any questions about how we're doing generally? We moved over the summer. I don't know if you're thinking, oh, I'm sitting in the same place. There was a bit of chaos within the department as we lost another floor. And this is kind of the background of, you know, why do things sometimes seem to take a long time? One answer is we spent several months preparing for a move, which means getting rid of documents and cleaning things out. We lost the 7th floor, gave it up in the lease, which meant everybody had to squish down. So the planning for that and moving, and then the trying to dig out and restore kind of the workflow after that is how we spent our summer vacation. So that's kind of, but now I find that I'm sitting in exactly the same spot I sat in 1992. Wow. What goes around comes around. I know.
You're wearing a different hat though.
And I'd like to put out, it is a different season. So any other questions for? Okay, excellent. Well, in that case, we'll move on to Karen Pelto and talk a little bit about natural resource damages. And Liz, you want?
Well, I was wondering if you wanted to mention.
This is the last appearance.
Yeah.
All right.
We know.
So some of you may have heard that among the retirees, Karen is retiring, effective officially, I think, on Monday. And for all of you who know about what a value Karen is to our program, it's a huge loss. Karen came here with the NRD program from EEA, and she's really the point person for everything about that program. And I'm even tearing up a little bit here. Oh, I didn't know this about myself. But the good news is that we are going to have Karen through a transitional period for part-time to help us kind of make the transition in terms of the current cases. And we are authorized to hire for her position, and we're moving ahead with that right away. But I just want to say a personal thank you to Karen, and yeah, that's it. Well, thank you, Liz and Paul, and you all. I would like to go out with a bang, not a whimper. So, but first I have to figure out where my presentation is, which is always the challenge. So yesterday, because Kathy Kiley is not downtown today, where is it? Okay. Is not downtown today. She said her, semi-official goodbye, even though it's not really goodbye, yesterday, and she was starting to tear up. Oh, I'm down here.
She's saying too?
No, she was saying goodbye to me.
Oh.
Sorry, I'm not starting any kind of rumor or anything like that. She just wanted to post the 30. I detected my graphics card may not be configured properly. Awesome.
Say okay.
We don't care.
You're fine.
For some reason, it's starting in the middle. Okay, there we go. So what I wanted to do was sort of set the stage for what I hope will be the person who takes over next, I hope will be part of their portfolio. And that has to do with the monitoring and stewardship activities associated with restoration projects that are funded through the natural resource damage settlements. This is a photo of seasonal staff monitoring the return of river herring to the Acushnet River. There are 3 obstructions that fishways were constructed, improved and or constructed as part of the New Bedford Harbor settlement, and then also importantly and rarely pre-construction and post-construction long-term monitoring was funded by the trustee council as part of this project and over time, and was able to document that between 2005 and 2014, we went from like 200 to 400 fish in the system to over 10,000 fish in this system. And so it's really important data. It's very rare. It led actually to some peer-reviewed literature, which is also terrific for NRD nationally to be able to contribute to the state of the science, and particularly relative to this component. Just again, a review of all the various settlements that we have recovered over time, and the vast majority of them were recovered. You know, you're typically, when you're recovering damages, you're basically saying, what type of restoration do we need to compensate for the loss, and how much is that restoration going to cost? And so, but I'll show you in a moment, in terms of the components of the cost of restoration, the vast majority of these settlements really only focused on a couple of those components. And so when you're looking at the cost of restoration, one could be, you know, do you actually own the property? Sometimes, in the vast majority of situations, we're working with public entities, municipalities, state-owned lands, land trust-owned lands. So often that is not an issue. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you're doing restoration on, in fact, later there's a project where we did restoration on a project that we funded that nonprofit to acquire in a previous round. So it was building on that prior acquisition. You know, you need to undertake planning and design. You need to undertake permitting, which in Massachusetts, as we all know, is a very big component of anything we want to do. Implementation, typically we've funded in the past or included in our cost of restoration the planning, design, and permitting, but probably not enough for the permitting. And implementation, but definitely never enough contingency to make adjustments based on field conditions, site conditions. Then the things that we really haven't funded and haven't really included in our settlement packages were monitoring. Really 2 components of that. One is the performance standards of monitoring to make sure that what you've implemented is as designed and is in the short-term functioning as designed, and then long-term. Oversight, which is a trustee responsibility. You know, when we're done with a project, we can't walk away. We're a trustee with a capital T, and we owe the public some level of involvement in that project to ensure that it is providing the long-term benefits that we had intended that project to provide. And often the way that you provide those long-term benefits is through some stewardship activities. This is a photo of what but what we alt text calls palm trees, so I'm going to be changing that, on Old Mill Trail, funded through the Housatonic Settlement. And so you've got trail maintenance, which an incredibly devoted team of volunteers is involved with every year. You've also got management of invasive species to ensure that the native habitats that are part of this site continue to thrive, and the nonprofit that manages this site has received Mass Wildlife Habitat Management grants in the past in order to do that. So in some cases, it's been the local partners have been terrific at finding other sources of funding to continue the stewardship activities, which is terrific, and we're not at all trying to indicate that that's not appropriate to do, but pointing out that these settlements did not provide for that, and so people have to get creative in making that happen. Another thing that came along recently that was certainly not in our thoughts when we settled a number of these cases is climate change. And so we in Massachusetts have, our governor issued an executive order, and there's one whereas that I thought was particularly relevant to natural resource damage restoration projects, in that you're looking at, well, how vulnerable are the projects that we've funded and implemented in the past to climate change impacts, and what, how resilient are they, and what types of adaptive measures should be taken to ensure that they continue to provide those public benefits. Some of our projects inadvertently ended up being really poster children for what NRD restoration can do to build resiliency. This is the Acushnet Sawmill Reserve, and this was for really hundreds of years a very active commercial property, including a sawmill, hence the name. And you're looking at the exact same location before and after. So first it was purchased by the Buzzards Bay Coalition, and then in later rounds of the New Bedford Harbor funding, they basically removed 5+ acres of pavement. They daylighted the river. They installed, where there had been once wetlands, a new red maple swamp wetland. There are trails here. There are the fishway one of the fishways that I mentioned is part of this system as well. It's a nature-like fishway. And so, and I just read they're expanding this project into New Bedford with Community Preservation Act funds. They have purchased 1.63 acres, of which 1.5 acres are forest, but with the rest they're going to improve their parking and also have some community gardens. So it's a project that keeps on giving. They have about 500 visitors a week to this site. And so this sort of captures a lot of what is sort of needed with a lot of projects, which is monitoring visitors. Is the public accessing and enjoying the investments that we've made? Second, not just performance monitoring in terms of, are the plants surviving? Are the trails holding up? But, and I'll get to later, what monitoring could we do in light of climate change to make sure that this is continuing to perform, and also to quantify the benefits that it's providing in terms of resilience to that area, especially for projects like this where you're essentially removing all that impervious surface and creating wetlands storage back where it used to be. So that's just something it offers an intriguing opportunity here. Another legislative piece that has fallen into place in the last couple of years is what we always call the Environmental Bond Bill, but this is its official title. And within DEP's line item of many, many different actions and activities that will be could be funded through this mechanism is for the long-term monitoring and stewardship of these restoration projects. And so we are really here to throw this idea out and see what thoughts you might have for how we might frame that, especially through the lens of climate change. This photo is of Bird Island. Bird and Graham Island in Buzzards Bay are the primary nesting and rearing areas for the endangered roseate tern in all of North America. Also for the common tern, which is actually rare. They tend to they nest together on islands. This is Carolyn Mostello, our coastal waterbird biologist from Mass Wildlife. This project was actually designed with climate change in mind, to basically give the island a few more decades of life in light of sea level rise. And it was completed, I think, 2 years ago in cooperation with the Army Corps of Engineers with state and federal funds. and really is performing quite well. But not all projects are designed with climate change in mind, and that's sort of another aspect is, as we look forward and implement new projects, what should we take into account? Again, a lot of the older projects didn't even have pre and post performance monitoring funding built into them. This project did. This is in round 2 of the Housatonic funding. We're now up to round 4 in the final round. And this is on Bartholomew's Cobble in Sheffield. And the trustees' reservations that manages that property were essentially transforming 3 hayfields that had once been floodplain forests back into floodplain forest. And the farmer who lives next door thought we were all insane because he spent a lot of time removing all those trees. And what were we doing, planting them all back? What were we thinking? But basically, the trees there are a mix of native, like beyond, like truly native. The seed stock came from the Housatonic floodplain, and those saplings were grown from those trees. And 10 acres of these former fields. And the initial performance monitoring showed, great results. Less than, I think only 1.5% of trees didn't survive, and that was mostly due to beaver activity. From 2014 to 2016, many of these trees, as you can see on the right, are over 10 feet tall now. This past summer, the Housatonic Trustee Council, we were out for a site visit related to a dam removal that is underway now in Pittsfield. We decided to pop in on some of our former sites, again in our trustee oversight role, and noted that the ash trees are completely dead. They have succumbed to the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect, and the short-term monitoring didn't show these effects. And again, our trustee oversight, we noted them, but it would be beneficial to have some kind of periodic monitoring in place, and also some funds for some.
May I ask a question, Karen?
Do you want me to hand to the mic, or is it okay? Mike?
I just had a few comments. That list that you have up there is a very similar list to what a lot of the conservation commissions in Massachusetts have been struggling with on their own projects and their own sites. And I would encourage whoever comes after you and fills your elected shoes, consider coordinating with the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissioners, because there are commissions in the state that have written their own local bylaws and local wetland regulations that have grappled with some of these. So for example, floodplain and requesting 2-to-1 flood storage and things like that for climate change, instead of reinventing the wheel. The other cross-pollination thing I see here is also with the MVP program. A lot of our towns have also gone through the municipal vulnerability preparedness, and in some cases, talked a lot about some of these issues as well, so it's worth it. And I would hope that there is some money for stewardship, because I know that some towns, including my town of Arlington, we struggle with that. I mean, we have volunteers who do it, but we struggle with finding the funding to keep going. And as you've seen with the ash borer, when you look at trees that are replanted, you can't just look in 2 years. I mean, it really doesn't give you an indication unless some trees just didn't get planted correctly. So you're looking at 5 years, 10 years out, and it's hard to find the funds just even to help those people get, gloves and things they need to go out there and do their work.
Thank you. Great, thank you. And I do want to mention, thank you for mentioning the municipal vulnerability preparedness program, because the culvert that I mentioned has an upstream culvert that's even bigger and even in worse shape from a fish and community point of view. And so it is proposed to receive some funding through Housatonic Round 4, but the vast majority of its funding is coming from an MVP grant, action grant that the city of Pittsfield got just this past year. So it absolutely is a great way to leverage these funds. I will mention, just in case this is helpful to people, since I won't be here to mention it next week, is that in terms of the MVP programs, other state funding can't be a match. And one of the flexibilities we have with these settlements, because we are working with our federal trustee partners, is that funding can come to a cooperative agreement through one of them and therefore serve as a non-state match. And if you're looking at a federal grant, if it comes to Massachusetts, it serves as a non-federal match. It's very flexible funding to get these things done. And as we all know, in order to achieve those multiple benefits, you often need multiple sources of funding. And you can get very creative in making a project happen.
Karen, in past meetings, you presented a financial model for assessing natural resource damages.
Mm-hmm.
Curious of the future of that and the large list of awards at the beginning. Were those based on that model or other legal means?
Sure. So yes, we are still working on the what we call the standard method for small to medium volume and impact oil spills, and we are also working on the regulatory language to accompany that. So that will be something that the larger we will be talking about again. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that I was available in this transitional period to help Liz with, I didn't want to just leave it all on her shoulders. So in terms of the past settlements, the ones where we actually have applied the model, one is the J.P. Noonan spill, which helped fund a restoration project in the town of Arlington. There's also one continuing in the city of Medford. And then recently, the Eversource spill in the Lower Mystic, which we will be combining with some remaining global Irving funds and going out for a solicitation of restoration projects probably within the next 3 to 6 months. And the others were all handled with a comprehensive assessment approach. Thank you so much. And I have to run to another call, but I appreciate it. If you have any other thoughts, I'm sure that Liz and Paul would be happy to hear them. Thanks.
Could you post your slides?
Yeah, the slides will be posted, as will the video, on our website. Yep.
So Liz, while you're doing that, I forgot one hiring thing when I was speaking before, which is one of the successful hires that we have is Diane Baxter, who, that's Diane back there. I went back and now I'm looking at the back of her head thinking, oh yeah, I forgot to mention Diane. Diane is our new division director for federal sites. So she takes, addresses and manages and supervises the work that we do for federal Superfund sites, record corrective action sites, the leaking underground storage tank program where we have a federal grant that helps out with that. Federal facility sites, anything that has federal or where we get federal money, Diane will be involved, and so she's taking a huge load off of my plate, which I really appreciate, and it's going to be great working with her. Thank you for still being here after several months.
Thanks, Paul, and I forgot to remind you about Diane. Sorry, Diane.
All right.
So for the remainder of the meeting, we're going to be going through the public comments that we received on the proposed MCP amendments, and we're going to be splitting the discussion between myself, Nancy Bettinger, and Paul. I'm going to start off just by talking about where we are right now in this process. As you know, the public comment period closed July 19th. We, DEP internally, are now involved in considering those comments, organizing them, setting up separate discussions to go through them, and preparing a response to comment document where we'll detail for each of the comment we receive, whether or not or how we're going to incorporate that comment into the final amendments. So we have all of the comments. We plan on posting them very soon on the same page where you can find the proposed MCP amendments. We have to redact a few emails and things like that, but we should be doing that very soon. Just an overview of what we received. So we had 51 sets of written comments. We also had 4 public hearings and a public meeting down at the Cave where we had testimony. I think 51 comment sets is a record in terms of at least the last few rounds of MCP amendments. Maybe only outdone by the original 1993 change in the program. 31 of those sets were exclusively about the PFAS proposals for reportable concentrations and cleanup standards. There were 8 that had both comments related to PFAS proposals as well as other MCP proposals, and then 12 that were strictly focused on something other than PFAS. One of the big developments in terms of how we're going to go forward with this, and I'll let Paul speak to it because he's really involved with the DEP's internal PFAS group and the decisions, is that at this point we're going to move forward with finalizing the PFAS reportable concentrations and method 1 standards and separate that from the rest of the MCP package. That will allow that piece to move more quickly and also allow us to coordinate that with, the initial steps of developing the maximum contaminant level. I just want to say that it's not an indication.
It'll move the PFAS section more quickly. I wasn't sure what was the answer. Which is going to move quicker?
It will move independently. I was about to say that we don't really plan on slowing down on the other MCP portions of it, but they're on a separate schedule so that kind of coordination between those 2 sets of proposals, we can move more independently as well as the PFAS proposals. I think Paul could probably explain the rationale behind that.
Yes.
That's what I wasn't clear.
I think Liz nor I would want to say, oh, the rest of the MCP stuff is going to go slowly, because that's not the case. It's just that the PFAS numbers, as you saw from the interest that everybody had in it, and the coordination needed, or that we would like to have with the drinking water program and their progress in setting an MCL, and that process is going to continue its public. We've had several meetings already, but that's going to pick up this fall. So part of that would be we've prioritized the review of the PFAS numbers, and so that what we come up with and put out for final will be what the drinking water program will start with for that. And again, to emphasize, if at the end of their process we end up with different numbers in a different place because new information comes out or different ways of looking at it, we, the department, including Wayside Cleanup, are committed to then going back and making sure that our numbers are consistent with the drinking water program. But we didn't want that the PFAS stuff to be tied to the rest of the MCP changes. So they're being cut out. They will be finalized most likely sooner. We hope that that will accelerate the pace of getting them out in final. So we anticipate having cleanup standards in soil and groundwater, and perhaps more importantly, notification requirements, explicit for PFAS RCs, that will go into effect sometime this fall. And when I say go into effect, the expectation is that when those numbers go out, the effective date for those numbers will be pretty quick. And that's another reason why it makes sense to separate it out. We can have a different effective date for that, and we receive comments on, and we'll have discussions about effective date of the entire MCP package, et cetera, et cetera. That can go along on its normal time.
A couple of other things, I would think in terms of what you're gonna hear today from Nancy, Paul, and myself, we're largely gonna focus on what we receive for public comments. We're probably not gonna say too much about where we're going with those comments yet, because we haven't had the internal discussions ready yet to say anything definitive. There might be a few exceptions. If we do say something about what we think we're likely to do, we also want to reserve the right to, revisit that because we haven't had those discussions. But what we're planning on doing, which we did as well back when we finalized the 2014 amendments, is scheduling some additional discussions. At least one, I can see 2 or 3 possibly. And we want to get one date on the calendar for that, which is October 15th here at 9:30. And what we did the last time, I think we'll do this again, is we'll come up with some discussion points that we want to go through. We'll get those out ahead of time and go through them at the meeting. I anticipate that the first meeting is most likely going to focus on the risk characterization proposals. And with that, let Nancy talk about those proposals.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So, I've kind of broken this out into 4 different categories. Comments on the PFAS standards, comments on the exposure point and exposure point concentration revisions, and on the provisions to prevent exposure to waste, and finally, the toxicity value hierarchy. So first, PFAS comments. So one big area of comments was and we solicited these comments, which PFAS should be included here. And we got comments that went in different directions. Some comments were supportive of including all PFAS that were proposed as a group. Another comment was to include additional longer chain PFAS in the group that we hadn't proposed to include. Another comment was to include only PFOA and PFOS, as the EPA has. And finally, there were comments to include everything we've included except for PFHPA and PFDA, and drop those out because there's less data on those and they're believed to have shorter half-lives. So those comments didn't tend to converge in one direction, but that was probably not unexpected. As far as comments on the PFAS groundwater 1 standards, I have these in terms of the water groundwater 1 standards, but they also reflect comments on the reference doses, development of the reference dose that was used to develop those standards. So again, these go in different directions. Some comments said that the proposed values are too high. Other states have lower values and have lower individual compound concentrations. And that those values are not protective of nursing infants. The opinion was they were not protective. And that epidemiological and cancer data support a concentration of 1 part per trillion. And then on the other end, we got comments saying that the proposed values are too low, that we should stick with EPA's PFOA and PFOS values of 70 parts per trillion, which is conservative enough. And in addition, I don't have it here, we had at least one set of comments that said that it should be even higher than 70. One overall comment that we got was that the basis for the standards was insufficiently explained, insufficiently documented. And there is a document in progress that will do that. So as far as the additivity idea, Again, comments went in different directions. Some said, treat all PFAS as a single class of compounds with one single concentration limit as we propose. And others said that they should be treated as individual compounds with no additive standard. Because the compounds are not sufficiently similar. I should point out here that the additive standard really was something that came from the need to develop a drinking water standard ultimately, that because in the MCP we, well, I guess not in method 1, but in method 3 in the MCP, they are, the risks are added anyway, so it's not that much of a difference for us. So some practical considerations. Some people said that proposed groundwater standards could be below background values for potable water and or for groundwater concentrations. Also, the standards, there were comments that said the standards should take into account the uncertainty associated with low-level detections, because these lower concentrations that are being required are closer to detection limits. And then finally, there were comments on implications for public water supply facilities that should be taken into account, but that will be taken into account by the people who are developing the drinking water standards. That's not really an MCP issue, yes.
Pardon my ignorance from a risk assessment perspective, but how can you have standards that are lower than background? How does that work?
Well, we don't think they're lower than background, but people made comments that they thought that background was higher than some.
So you have to determine
Now I
background, is
understand.
that
Yeah.
we have to have some kind of support for what is background.
We always consider that. That always is considered, yes.
Thank you.
And kind of to put it in perspective, there has been a lot of sampling going on out in the world and in Massachusetts. So while we have not done an intentional groundwater background sampling program, there have been a lot of samples that one could look at across the state, both public and private wells that could stand in for that. And I think I can confidently say that the levels that we're talking about are well above what we're seeing kind of as standard in areas that are above what would be unaffected levels. So I think for the groundwater levels, we appear to be well above what might be background.
Okay, so before I move on to soil, I just wanted to mention, it doesn't show up on here, but we did get comments on the proposed GW3 standards to the effect that they should be more protective they should be lower to protect aquatic organisms. So as far as the soil standards go, there were comments that indicated that people felt they were premature because, partly because no EPA-approved analytical methods exist yet. There were comments on the RLs that we use to develop the soil standards, that achieving those isn't really feasible. Comments on the idea that the values that we proposed are above background as demonstrated by recent data from Vermont soils. And finally, that the leaching approach is overly conservative, and documentation for the DAF should be provided and made more clear. Okay, does anybody have any comments on PFAS? Okay. So then we come to comments on the exposure points and exposure point concentrations. And again, there were a lot of comments on this area, as was probably expected. So one overall comment was that the opinion that DEP should move all of this exposure point concentration material to section 40.08, which it is where general site assessment requirements are addressed, and that putting it in with the risk assessment requirements, is kind of out of place because that's later in the process. Another comment is that exposure point concentration requirements are too prescriptive. The rules should allow for more professional judgment by LSPs. Also, that we should clarify what type of justification for sample size should be provided. People suggested that any sites that, have been already notified into the system, any sites already in the system should be grandfathered and be able to use the older requirements, not the newer requirements. And, finally, that we should use a different acronym for upper concentration limit. And I have to admit, we're not responding to comments here, but that is my favorite comment. Okay, so as far as soil exposure points and exposure point concentrations, and use of the upper confidence limit, people made the point that the arithmetic mean has been used for a long time, since 1993, and that in general, people are using the arithmetic mean with judgment sampling, and that combination is already conservative enough to be protective. There were comments to the effect that the upper confidence limits would overestimate the mean and add an unnecessary layer of conservatism to the risk assessment. That the maximum should be allowed when the 95% UCL is higher than that. And finally, that we should explicitly allow the 95% UCL for a normally distributed data set. As far as soil point, as far as applying the upper confidence limit to soil exposure points, there were a number of comments on the 2,000 square foot criterion that we had, that it wouldn't work to distinguish simple sites from complex sites, or to determine the appropriate exposure point concentration. Also comments that the change would create uncertainty for closed sites and may require new phase 2 assessments at sites that are in temporary solutions. And in addition, again, there were comments about not applying these new requirements to sites that have already been reported into the system. And then as far as consistent methodology, it was noted that a different approach is used for every median. Some people said that the goal should be a statistically defensible, adequate, and representative EPC for the receptor, no matter what the receptor is, and that the EPC methodology should be for the same for soil and sediment, and for humans and wildlife. And specifically that the UCL should also be used for ecological receptors. You have confidence in ecological receptors. As far as comments on groundwater exposure points, there was a request to clarify that an average can be used to estimate exposure points for non-GW1 groundwater, and some places that was put in terms of clarify that an average can be used for method 3. That is using an average as opposed to an upper confidence limit. And also to clarify that the presence of additives would not necessarily preclude the use of petroleum exemption. One comment that I didn't,
this is somewhat nuanced, but I noticed you had a comment twice that this didn't apply to sites that are already reported, but I think, if I recall, there may have also been a variation on that it doesn't apply to sites where the phase 2 has already been completed.
oh, yes.
So
yes.
those
are really.
Okay, well, there's a nuance, but those are very
Yes.
different evaluations for
Yes,
DEP.
And I'm going to touch upon that too, so
Okay.
I'm going to cover other comments we got on the effective date.
So, now we are on the comments that we proposed to, for provisions to eliminate exposure to waste. First of all, people felt that we hadn't sufficiently defined what we meant by areas of waste disposal. And in addition, there were a lot of comments on what waste is included in those provisions, and a lot of confusion about that and calls to be more clear about that. And again, although I don't want to talk about responses to any of these comments, I do want to point out one clarification here. There were a lot of comments with concerns about petroleum products and LNAPL and how that would fit in, how these waste provisions would apply to LNAPL. So I just want to say that when we proposed them, in talking about waste, we intended this to apply to stuff that's already waste before it goes into the environment. So in that sense, you know, a leaking tank with fuel in it, that's not waste, that was product before it went into the environment. We were just talking about waste, so I wanted to make that clarification, so people could have it in mind for future discussions, that was the original intent, that LNAPL was never intended to be included. So, I suppose I should name, I'm not sure everyone can see these slides, but other comments that people had were whether sludges from tanneries or plating operations were included, box waste, ferrocyanide, is that included, should it be included? Demolition waste, clinkers, rubber, burn dumps, landfills, waste lagoons were all conditions that were mentioned that people weren't clear on, either whether we meant to include it or whether they thought it should be included. So, there were comments on whether these revisions were really necessary. Comments to the effect that oil from different sources should not be treated differently. So, oil that's waste, or oil or tar that's waste, that's similar to other petroleum products, should be treated differently from them. There was a comment that, at least one comment, that coal tar DNAPL is chemically and physically similar to petroleum LNAPL, and there's no justification for treating those differently. And then another comment that the requirements for a permanent solution relative to source elimination and control should be, that are already in the MCP, should be sufficient to address the concerns that we were trying to address in these revisions. Okay, and so you'll recall that one part of this was to say that the UCLs had to be, would be applied to waste in and of itself, waste deposits, and so there were a number of comments on that. One was that this will lead to expensive solutions, engineered barrier, removal or fixation at more sites, that would be required to achieve a permanent solution at more sites. There was another comment that the proposed approach could force more sites into a temporary solution. It's kind of the other side of the coin from that first comment that I mentioned, I guess. And that capping and AULs should be allowed for these sites. And that, and finally, that there was a concern that some wastes analytically wouldn't be treated as solid when analyzed because they're really treated more as a liquid, and you would end up with analytical concentration limits that may not be comparable to the units that in which the UCLs are expressed, which are units of soil concentration. And then there were another group of comments that were really focused on waste deposits, treating waste deposits as hotspots. And the main one was that as an exposure point, the hotspot is subject to upper concentration limits, which we just talked about, and that remediation and engineered barriers would be required at more sites because of treating it as a hotspot. And that another comment was that areas of waste disposal are adequately addressed already as sources under the MCP. There were comments to the effect that there should be some size criterion to eliminate small pockets of waste and thin layers of waste from consideration as under these provisions. Collection of NAPL samples for analysis would be problematic, and this goes back to something I just talked about, that the units may not match the UCL units, and average concentrations versus the UCL should not be allowed. Or should be allowed, I'm sorry. So in other words, I mean, people are making the point that hotspots are often small areas, and you're not going to have a lot of samples from a small area, and it wouldn't be appropriate to calculate a UCL from a small number of samples. There were also comments on, related to readily apparent harm, and these kind of went in different directions too. Some comments said MDP waste should not be included in the definition of readily apparent harm specifically because it's already included in the language about cars and oils. So the addition is not necessary. And there were other comments that the existing definition really should be modified, and a similar condition should be added for method 3 human health risk characterization. So in other words, add a readily apparent harm provision for human health. Right now, we just have that for collectibles. Finally, come to the toxicity value hierarchy comments. A lot of people felt that specific values should not be written into the regulation, that section 6, section 40.0993 should be removed entirely, and that the MassDEP toxicity value should be published in a separate document and just referenced in this. There's also a comment noting that lead, I think a couple comments noting that lead was not included in the list of Massachusetts toxicity values, even though MassDEP does have specific values of it. So this is you.
Yeah.
I'm done. Does anybody have any questions on anything that might not have been clear from what I just said?
Okay, you would thought Nancy would cover this, but she didn't want to take ownership of this issue, so I am. In terms of exposure point concentrations for indoor air, several commenters pointed out that the language that was proposed is inconsistent with the language in MassDEP's vapor and treating guidance. And our intent was to be consistent with that guidance. In looking at that, I would agree that there is inconsistency there. And I would say this is a kind of issue that's important enough that I think when we meet, this would be something where DEP would, bring the proposed change to this language so that people could take a look at it. On the effective date, Nancy talked a little bit about this, and Eileen mentioned this. We got several comments on the effective date of the MCP amendments, and most of them were focused around the issue of the new approach for soil exposure point concentrations and the implications of that for projects that are underway and site assessments and risk characterizations that have already been conducted based on existing information. We propose that the reportable concentrations take effect on the date that the regulations are published, and that the balance of the amendments would take effect 2 months from the publication date. And we also further propose that we would publish the proposed Method 1 cleanup standards as Method 2 numbers. We have a provision to do that and allow people to use those numbers during that interim period of time. In terms of the comments we received, as I mentioned, the exposure point concentrations in soil approach was mentioned as a reason to consider handling the effective date differently than we proposed. There were comments to grandfather phase 2 work and risk characterizations that were submitted prior to the effective date. Also, as Nancy mentioned, to make the new approach for EPC provisions only apply to those sites that notified, did I say prior for sites that notify? Make new provisions optional for sites that notify prior to the effective date. So that would tie that again to when the site was first notified to the department. And then there were a couple of comments about addressing this issue by providing a longer period of time between the time we publish and by the time the provisions go into effect. And the recommendations were 3 and 6 months. Moving on to another topic, active exposure pathway elimination measures definition. We proposed a change to the definition to make it more specific, and this was consistent with our original intent to define, in particular, focusing on the vapor intrusion pathway, the systems used to mitigate vapor intrusion, to limit those to simple systems. The proposed definition, and to differentiate, so that we could differentiate those from active remedial systems. And the reason why that distinction is important is that the active exposure pathway mitigation measures are eligible for a permanent solution, active remedial systems are not. So we propose a tightening of that definition. It was pointed out to us that with respect to the vapor intrusion pathway, we really just described a sub-slap depressurization system, and that didn't allow for other types of pressurization systems, which our own vapor intrusion guidance recognizes as acceptable approach for mitigating the pathway, and in some cases, at some sites, really only possible approach that can be used. There were other proposals related to active exposure pathway mitigation systems with respect to supporting temporary and permanent solutions and remedy operation status. And one of the areas where we received a lot of comments was the proposal to define what we now have as indication of the failure of the system, and that would trigger notification to the department and to the building operator. In practice, we have implemented that as system shutdown, and we're monitoring with telemetry shutdown and restart, but the department was proposing to move to really measuring when the system falls outside of the pressure range in the operating regimen. So in terms of the comments we received, there were comments about, in general, about DEP is making this whole process a little more complicated and burdensome, and in some cases, this additional level of monitoring and I think added protectiveness that we were seeking with monitoring the pressure being consistent with the operating regimen was really not justified by the costs, or it should at least be focused on the situations that were of higher risk in terms of focusing on residential properties and not extending this to other types of commercial buildings or to situations in temporary solution. Another definition proposal, we propose to add an additional clause to the anthropogenic background definition. And the reason for this was that the historic fill definition, which anthropogenic background is, which is a part of the anthropogenic background definition, while it identifies coal ash and wood ash, that's really, that definition is based on the fill being primarily soil. So it technically didn't cover situations where you would have layers of ash and coal ash and wood ash that were deposited historically, but they really aren't soil. So we propose to add this attributable to coal ash, wood ash, excluding ash landfills, into the anthropogenic background definition. There was generally support for doing that, although there were several comments about the ambiguity of the language and seeking clarification or guidance on how you would distinguish what our intent was, some layers from a ash landfill. This was also a definition change, but it's really an extended seeking comment note in the regs on whether or not we should move towards requiring GPS information be provided to the department for the location of monitoring wells. And our note went into what we saw as the benefits of having this information available to all of us. And we saw a comment on what this would mean for the practice and the costs of doing so, and whether commenters also would value this information. And in terms of where this came up in the proposed amendments, we had added this to the definition of monitoring wells. So monitoring wells was defined as monitoring wells that had also included GPS information. And so there were a mix of comments that we received. Most people were in support of the idea of gathering the information. There was some opposition and some questioning of the benefits, and also questioning how we would ensure the quality of the information. But there were also, even among those who supported it, significant questions about implementation and how we would roll this out. And whether we should, roll it out as a requirement or, do this initially voluntarily. There was a comment that this should be uploadable information so that people aren't left having to hand enter it. That we should specify the level of accuracy. That we should be coordinating this requirement with what's required under the MassDEP's well driller registration program. And that we should resolve these types of issues before we would implement it. Release abatement measures, we had a couple of proposed amendments in this section of the regs, and the one that drew a lot of comments was related to our restoring some language that had, I think as we described in the notes, been inadvertently dropped out of the MCP during one of the previous revisions. And I think that occurred at the time when the approvals for release abatement measures went from presumptive approval to no presumptive approval. But there had been a limitation in the RAM section for situations where an immediate response action arises at a site with a RAM, that continuation of the RAM or a new RAM in that situation, in that portion of the site, could not occur unless additional approval was sought by the department. And the comments included, I think seeking department experiences as to why this was necessary. Had we seen situations where this was problematic? Also clarifying what we meant by the portion of the site, and also pointing out that in many cases the IRA will not have impact on the RAM and vice versa, and distinguishing between those situations. We also had some language with respect to the activities you need to do when you're conducting a RAM as part of construction and doing a focus site and risk characterization and source removal within the footprint and adjacent to the area where the building is being constructed. And we propose kind of a slight shift in the language there. As it reads now, you should be conducting these types of assessment activities and looking at the potential for doing source removal prior to or during construction. And we reworded it in the proposed amendment that it should be done prior to the extent feasible. And that proposal was based on department experience with some problem proposals where RAMs had been initiated and unforeseen, or what we thought could have been foreseen issues arose in conducting the RAM. But the comments in opposition to that, were that it's too ambiguous in terms of what is considered feasible. So there were a number of different changes, kind of as a package related to tier classification extensions, clarifying when temporary solutions needed tier classification extensions, specifying when temporary solutions needed status reports, and generally those were proposed for the part of the regs now that's at 40.0560, paragraph 7. So one of the proposed changes was to get around what has been kind of confusing in terms of the existing language about when tier classifications extensions are necessary, and to eliminate that as an issue by just saying all of these sites, except for those in run operation status, require tier classifications extensions, or at least require that that condition, that status, remain in effect. We clarified and established status report frequencies for sites and temporary solutions. And the distinction among those sites is those that are conducting active operation and maintenance and those that are not. Active operation and maintenance, those sites are, there are rules in effect about 6-month status reports for those sites. For sites that aren't conducting active operation and maintenance, we propose that we would establish a 1-year status report, but with the option that the PRP could come back to us just fine. Something less than that, up to and including just every 5 years, consistent with the periodic evaluation that they're having to conduct anyway for temporary solution sites. And then we also propose that where status reports are coming in at the frequency specified, that the status report would effectively serve as the tier classification extension. So no separate tier classification extension submittal would be necessary. We'd be getting information that the work on the site is continuous, so it would remain in effect. So in terms of comments we received, there were a lot of proposals there, so we received a lot of different comments on different aspects of it. I think there was some general support for it in terms of it making things clearer and in some cases simpler. And there were several commenters that said what is missing from what was proposed is transition provisions in terms of those sites in temporary solution now. What is the date by which they need to be coming in with status reports? How do those sites that where they're lapsed in terms of compliance, how do those come back in? And I would agree that those kind of provisions are necessary. There was a proposal in the phase 3 selection of remedial alternatives that the evaluation of feasible remedial alternatives must consider remedies to reduce exposure to human ecological receptors, including drinking water resources at portions of disposal sites in cases where permanent solution for the entire disposal site is not feasible. So as the note reviewer described, this is to make clear that feasibility evaluations shouldn't take an all or nothing approach. Again, comments related to feasibility evaluations are subjective, that the risk reduction that would be evaluated as part of this in terms of cost benefits of what's feasible to do at a portion of site need quantitative goals. Otherwise, we're just looking at an arbitrary percentage reduction. How are we envisioning portion would be defined? And that existing provisions that we already have in terms of taking action to address IRA conditions or no substantial hazard already achieve this kind of reduction focus on these exposures. Climate change, Karen talked about this earlier with respect to natural resource damage projects and how they are effective in many cases in providing solutions to some climate change issues. We propose in the MCP to incorporate consideration of climate change with respect to cleanup activities in a couple of different portions of the MCP, including adding consideration of potential impacts due to climate change into the definition of conceptual site model. In the response action performance standard, we added consideration of Executive Office of Environmental Affairs guidance, and as well as models in addition to scientific data that should be considered as part of RAPS, because the guidance that the state is making available now is coming from Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. And we added to the foreseeable conditions with respect to looking at no significant risk for both current site conditions and future site conditions that consider projected impacts from climate change. And with respect to the comments we received on this, I think most commenters recognize that this is a valid concern, and they're in particular at certain types of sites, this would be a valid concern. The comments were pretty consistent in saying that there's a real need for guidance. There was concern about what DEP's expectations would be for this kind of taking all this into account at a disposal site. There were comments concerned that we were looking for really a disposal site specific evaluation, a disposal site specific assessment in terms of gathering the data for this. And I think to address that concern, we really were trying to emphasize that you would make use of the information that the state is making available and other agencies have made available, but similar or including the information that's been pulled together by the state for the municipal vulnerability preparedness program. So that was our intention, was not to have a site-specific gathering of information, but that you would use what is out there provided by the state. And then there were, and one of the suggestions in terms of clarifying the text was to make that clear that we were really looking at what's available from current science and models, and to add that text to those provisions. And there are other suggestions as well to make add additional language to make it more specific, and also make it a consideration of temporary solutions. We had proposed an activating use limitation for NAPL with microscale mobility. So NAPL that you're seeing in a well or an excavation boring that is greater than a ½ inch. And the comments we received on that are that the ½ inch appears to be an arbitrary cutoff, not really connected to any kind of gauge of what future potential concerns would be with the NAPL in terms of future construction and the management of the NAPL. There were a couple suggestions. One included to keep the proposal to require an activity and use limitation for NAPL greater than a ½ inch, but to also for NAPL less than that, to have that condition covered by a new permanent solution with conditions. So permanent solution with conditions in that case would provide notice that NAPL is present at the site. And a different spin on that that thought would be to eliminate the AUO requirement, but to create a category of permanent solution with conditions for any NAPL that's remaining that has microscale mobility. In terms of permanent solutions and remediation waste, this is another example where we went back and said, hey, we used to have a provision that said something like this, and it appears to be no longer there. So we reinserted language related to removal of remediation waste when, as a condition of having a permanent solution. And it was really targeted at trying to ensure that existing soil stockpiles left over from remedial activities were managed and taken off-site if necessary before filing a permanent solution. The comments pointed out that this would, as written, is broader than just soil stockpiles and would also address things like the dismantling of remedial systems, and it would delay permanent solutions in those cases where a remedial system dismantling would generate remediation waste. It also causes confusion for those post-permanent solution provisions at 1067, which have you going back and doing additional work at a site after a permanent solution where you'd be generating remediation waste, and that should at least be clarified. Email notices, using email to provide written notices to local officials, probably the most popular change we proposed. We proposed that you could, as an option, send written notices that are now required by using email, but we also proposed that you could do that once you had written agreement that the intended recipient, the city or town, agrees to receiving notice by email. Comments on that were that the requirement to get their written agreement sort of kind of undid the benefit of being able to use email. I know when we talked about this before, we said the department could see making an effort to contact cities and towns and kind of get a list of those that were okay with or preferred email notice. That was one way to get around that. But the comment was that that's really not necessary. Everyone uses email now, and we shouldn't be requiring any kind of additional agreement, written agreement. And then there were some comments that pointed out that there were discrepancies in our existing notices in terms of the language in that section, in terms of when notices are also required to be copied to MassDEP. Almost done. I think this might be the last thing I have before I turn it over to Paul. So notice to affected individuals, we have an existing requirement for notifying affected individuals when an IRA is being done to address an imminent hazard or a CEP condition that involves remedial action. And we had proposed to change this to have this notice also required in those situations where assessment work confirms an imminent hazard or CEP condition, because what MassDEP has found is that affected individuals and those observing people coming and going doing response action at a site are as concerned about the sampling results and learning about that information as they are about when it actually leads to remedial actions. The other part of this proposal was to require that when you're looking at multi-unit buildings, that
Batteries? Battery hit it? Did I?
No.
I have a loud voice. The other part of it was that for multi-unit buildings, that you would also post this notice for the duration of the response actions. And that MassDEP be sent documentation that you've taken all these steps with the first status report. Currently, we ask for the documentation at the IRA completion statement point, but based on our experience, we wanted confirmation that these steps will be taken sooner. In terms of the comments that we received, there was agreement in most cases that providing notice once the sampling is done.
Once sampling confirms that an imminent hazard or CEP condition exists, makes sense in terms of what people are interested in and also in effective risk communication at the site. There was some disagreement with the need to post the notice in terms of multi-unit buildings. The comments cited situations where activities are really involving a couple of units in a very large building, and that kind of broadcasting the notice across all the users of the building really isn't consistent with effective risk communication because it's not targeted, and can also, go in the other direction in terms of raising concern where it's not necessary. And then there was a comment, while we're looking at this issue, that we should consider that the form we use for this, the BWSC 124, is not really effective in terms of communicating what's going on to the layperson, and that we should consider making available fact sheets that can be used to assist with the risk communication. So I'm going to turn these over to Paul. Are there any questions about what I just went through? Larry?
When you have the list of, when you talk about the definition of monitoring well, the thing that was not listed in the comments was a simple bastardization of the English language by redefining monitoring well as something as a vertical hole in the ground without GPS, as opposed to all those other vertical holes in the ground that we already have there.
Oh, I thought I had that on the list, but one of the comments, which I will say I agree with, is, and we knew this at the time, we kind of just said, where are we going to put this proposal, and we attached it to the monitoring well definition, but that wasn't the place for it, that we should, if we are going to require GPS, that we should consider putting it, for example, in the well maintenance and security section. So I agree with that.
Thank you.
There were also comments that why limit it to monitoring wells, and in terms of other kind of excavations or soil gas sampling points.
One step at a time. Okay, so we're gonna come into the home stretch, right?
Back to you later. No.
Oh, all right, this is the home stretch. A few things. One of my favorite parts of the MassDEP changes, a new adequately regulated provision. And as we have sites that have had various combinations of radioactive waste and non-radioactive oil and hazardous material, either each one of them either there alone or separately, and trying to figure out how to best manage these. We've been working with the MassDEP Radiation Control Program to identify a process and a set of criteria that would allow these sites to, one, be assessed, two, be cleaned up if necessary, three, have each agency doing what it is best at and has a lot of experience doing. So for sites that have radioactive materials, MassDEP would like to rely upon the DPH RCP staff to help us out where we come across those. And as we help them out, where if you have a radioactive site over there at a licensed facility, if there's also releases of oil and hazardous material, we deal with that. So consistency, efficiency between programs. This slide lays out the various combinations of, if you're regulated by them, then do this. if you're identifying us, do that. Kind of the really interesting and really interesting part here, I think, is really the sites that are not licensed by DPH, the Radiation Control Program. So they're outside of their system. Radioactive materials are hazardous materials under 21E. 21E and the MCP process would apply to the assessment and cleanup of those. The question then becomes, what's the best way to do that assessment, do that cleanup, reach endpoints that we can agree pose no significant risk in a way that kind of maximizes or best uses all the resources among the different programs. So what we have been proposing at sites with first with radioactive material, that even though you're doing that cleanup under 21E, that you look to the processes and procedures and standards under the Radiation Control Program and use that to determine the appropriate cleanup values for the radioactive materials. You achieve those levels, that would be considered a level of no significant risk under 21E. And for all of the regular oil and hazardous material, you would follow the regular 21E process. Going along with that and consistent with the Radiation Control Program, if there are situations where there's residual radioactive material left above background levels, that would require an activity and use limitation to let people know that that's there. The comments were blessedly minimal.
Blessedly few of those sites.
Blessedly few of those sites. I think in looking at the comments, if you have been working on one of these sites, this is very important to you. Otherwise, you read it, you say, yeah, sounds good, and moved on. There were a couple, so it was generally supportive, including the AUL, if you have residual radioactive material there, and it's a good use of the adequately regulated approach. There, on the question of, particularly for 21E sites, where it's not regulated by DPH, right, just described that you use DPH's approach for that, it is a different approach than the regular oil and hazardous material approach. Dose-based versus risk-based is one way of looking at it. So it's different from what EPA would take, the approach EPA would take, for example, if they were looking at this. And that in the past has caused some confusion, and they do reach different endpoints. And frankly, the EPA risk approach typically would give more stringent cleanup. But we were weighing the costs and the benefits and the risks and the risks and benefits associated with this. And where we came down is, in working with DPH, is that having the resources and ability to work with DPH and having a consistent state approach for this kind of outweighed the differences in risk and different cleanup levels that might come out of that. But we did have comments on both sides of that issue. One proposing that we go with the EPA risk-based approach. Other comments saying we should give the option for one or the other, which frankly I think that's the worst of both worlds. And so what we wanted to have here is clear, consistent approach, clear endpoint that the state across its various programs feel comfortable. The reclamation soil provisions, we had a change to one of the notification exemptions to very specifically include or broaden the notification exemptions for these facilities, because the reclamation facilities that we've been permitting through the use of the ACOs will be taking soil from 21E sites, obviously, but they also can take soil from other locations that are not in 21E. So we want to be very specific here that these facilities can avail themselves of this notification provision, exemption, if, of course, they're following their permit, their license, their ACO, the rules that apply to them, even if they're accepting soil from non-MCP sites. And that's the simple change that was there. Somebody suggested a comma. I'm not quite sure whether that actually is an Oxford comma or not.
Before the close quotation.
Yeah, so, well, and there's that, I know. I just don't like that. So we did add, we will be adding the comma. When I reread it even before, hopefully in the appropriate place. I guarantee nothing. Especially when we then have to send it up to the Secretary of State's office and they do the editing. Who knows where the comma will end up? And they may have a grammar person up there that just is opposed to Oxford commas. The remediation waste provision, we had provisions added prohibiting the dilution of remediation waste with other uncontaminated material. Dilution is not the solution, et cetera, and requires, if you are inadvertently mixing this material together, or contaminated material with clean material, you have to manage the mixed waste as remediation waste. The comments that we got were getting to things like geotechnical activities, jet crowding, where you may in fact be creating some mixtures as part of that, and there are stockpiling and sampling issues that might come up. Of course, if you have stock excavation and stockpiling and then sampling, there were also questions about whether the site was adequately characterized before you did that. But there are a bunch of specific variations on this that we can take into account as we look at them, where the goal is not to eliminate jet crowding or something like that. And those, at the meeting maybe that we have, these are the sort of things that we come with specific kind of changes and proposals for language that once we talk with our regional staff. Clarifying that wastewater is a remediation waste. Very few comments. To the extent that we had comments, they were very supportive of that. Not maybe very supportive. Supportive. Support. I mean, any support is very enthusiastic. The containerized waste does not include contaminated media. So there was support for that. And some questions about, there's some comments on it as well. What if testing of contaminated media shows that it's hazardous waste? Does it become containerized? I think the more important question is, does it become hazardous waste? And the answer being yes. And then the question of is granulated activated carbon a containerized waste? I went back and looked at some of the training that we've done in the past, which had clearly said that yes, GAC is a containerized waste. Okay, so that. So, wait a second. This is what I was thinking around, I like these almost as much as I like flowcharts. The whole containerized waste versus non-containerized waste question. And so this is one of the kind of conversations I want to have again at the meeting, and probably go on for this for a long while. Because I find that every time we talk about waste and containerized waste and remediation waste and all of the interactions on all of this, it's, we have to spend at least 15 minutes talking about it so everybody's kind of on the same general frame of what we're talking about and why and what the implications of all of this is. So I think we'll run through all of this again at the next meeting, just to make sure we're clear of what we're doing and why we want to do it. Oh, this was the thing. Slide from the 2009, a really great training. The Bill Sorrell, Jeff Corman, training on remediation or on waste management in general, and you have your GAC there. Imminent hazards. Yeah, I know. So we've talked about this before and why we're doing this, and the change that was proposed was a very simple change, changing the greater than risk management criteria indicating an imminent hazard to equal to or greater than the risk management criteria. And the implication, of course, and I hate even using the words, is that rounding down, rounding to one significant figure, in the current way of looking at it, rounding can change the outcome and the conclusion of an assessment. In the proposed revisions, rounding would not change the outcome or conclusions. Well, no, it would, but to the extent that it changes the outcome or conclusions, it does in a health protective way. There's a bias for being conservative and protective in a situation where it's early on, you may not have a lot of information about the site or about that particular exposure. There's a potential for an imminent hazard. And what we have found is that we often see arguments that, well, it's, the calculated value is greater than the imminent hazard criteria, but if you're on to one significant figure, given the uncertainty, no immediate action is necessary, and particularly given the uncertainty. On the other hand, if you're close to that criteria, and given the uncertainty, nobody ever makes the decision that, well, given the uncertainty around this calculated number, we will take action rather than not. And that for imminent hazard decisions, that bias towards no action does not seem appropriate. So people have said it eliminates the standard practice of rounding to one significant figure. I would point out that it says nothing about your ability to round to one significant figure. It's allowable now, it will be allowable into the future. So I would say that comment is incorrect. Overly conservative, of course, is an arguable and relative way of looking at it. Inconsistent with other risk management criteria, yes, it is. And I think there is an argument that early on in the process, when you might not have a lot of information and where the stakes are higher, there is a reason and justification, and it's appropriate to use a mechanism that is biased towards action. Whereas after a comprehensive site assessment where you know more about what's going on and you're making permanent, looking for the long term, and you can evaluate a lot of this, that it may be appropriate and justifiable to look at it in a different way. So yes, it is inconsistent, but there's that whole thing about a foolish consistency. If we go into it knowing why we're doing it and feeling comfortable with why we're doing it, I think inconsistency is fine. And if not, there is a way to make it consistent.
I'm no risk assessment expert, so I don't know I'm no risk assessment expert in terms of how the numbers work, but I guess my question is, has DEP observed sites with problems where this is the cause? Is there a problem to be fixed here, or is this more growing out of a general tendency to try and be conservative when there's an opportunity to do it?
It's a good question, and I would say that there is a problem. And again, like many of the things that we're talking about in the spray package, it's not at every site, and but is it important where it comes up? And I would say yes. And the issue that we are struggling with, and that we have been struggling with some PRPs and their consultants with, and looking at it from different perspectives, is the really bad imminent hazards, that the concentrations, the exposures are so great, everybody agrees that, we're going to go out and do it. That's not a problem. And there are a lot of sites out there that don't pose an imminent hazard at all. So already you're narrowing it down to a much more limited universe. But the ones where this does come into play, where the calculated risk, calculated exposures are kind of right at that breakpoint, then not only, it may be a small number of sites, but they are sites that are kind of high profile. The stakes are higher both from a risk point of view and from a kind of process point of view, communication with people that are the affected individuals that we talked about earlier. and kind of how the process works. And what, you know, we put a lot of emphasis on risk communication, for example, and trying to make people, help people understand what's going on, why we're doing things. And what we find when the risks inevitably come back, calculated as a, let's say, hazard index of 1.33712. But 1.3, and with one significant figure, you would round that down to 1. So you have calculated values that show that there's some exposure. It's right around that value. It's 1.3, it's right around 1. Above it, you do one thing, below it, you do another thing. The communication aspects of it, and these are situations where people are being exposed. They are drinking contaminated water, or they are breathing contaminated air. Because if they weren't, there would be no exposure, there would not be an imminent hazard. So you're dealing with exposures that are there. We're already dealing with potentially substantial release migration, or what's that other thing? Substantial release migration leads to critical exposure pathway. I'm getting old.
Older.
You stand up in front of a crowd and you just blank on certain things that you know. Critical exposure pathway. So there are biases for taking action in these situations, and we don't want to be in a situation. We find ourselves in a situation of kind of having ongoing, longer than we really should discussions. But well, is 1.3 really above 1? Is it okay to let these people breathe this contaminated air for a little while? And obviously, I'm being a little bit biased and snarky here. But I find it hard to be in a situation where, kind of from the other side, and I find it hard to put myself in your shoes, say that, well, yes, people are being exposed. Yes, it's close to an imminent hazard, but it calculated as 1.3, but in reality, it's 1.3 is no different from 1. But at that point, 1 is no different than 1.3 either. You're really at this point where it could be an imminent hazard. You don't really have a lot of information. And we think in those situations, the bias should be towards actually taking action. So, in a shorter answer to your question, it's not a huge problem in terms of numbers, but on any given site, it's very awkward and difficult to be having this conversation over and over again. And especially if we put out numbers, we publish numbers and say, and people can do this in calculations, a hazard index of 1 for chemical X is associated with a concentration of 37 parts per billion, if you do the math. So it comes up with a number, a measurable number, a standard or an action level, if you will. But then you could calculate, well, but a value of 1.4 would be 44 parts per billion. So if you go out and measure 44 parts per billion, even though it's above the 37 that's out there as the action, it's hard to say that, well, 44 really is no different from 37. Even though the lab will be telling you that, well, we can measure that, and 44 actually is in the environment different from 37. So this, I think, simplifies all of that, and I think won't affect a lot of sites, but where it comes into play, it will certainly streamline things.
Can we talk about that last bullet before you switch?
I suggested insertion of unrounded to clarify that rounding up is not necessary. Interesting thing.
Considering your last discussion.
It's an interesting thing that many of you may remember the discussions that we had about rounding over the years.
Oh, yes.
Oh, and for those that don't, there is a policy paper on significant figures that's out there that is not one of my favorites. But it's riveting. But if you remember when we were going through that, there were a lot of discussion about the scientific purity of rounding significant figures, and that really if the factors that go into a calculation, if some of them, even just one of them, only has one significant figure, really you're kind of in a moral quagmire. if you don't round to one significant figure. One has to. So it was interesting, given all of that, those scientific arguments, and a little bit holier than thou arguments at times, about how important it is to round to the appropriate number of significant figures, to then come with this proposal where rounding to one significant figure actually might change the determination that, suddenly it might be okay not to round, that it might be scientifically justified just if you calculate out to 3 significant figures, and that shows that the hazard rates of 0.9596, that would be okay, and 0.96 is different from 1. And suddenly not rounding is appropriate. I thought that was interesting, so I added it as a bullet. And if you go back to that paper that I love so much, the significant figures paper, that had actually offered an option of not rounding, that we would accept unrounded calculations there. We have not had this discussion internally, but my gut feeling is that paper would probably still stand, that even with this change, we would probably accept unrounded values. Ooh, and that's it. Well, we can go back to that. We have a lot of time now. I didn't realize this was the last slide. We could talk about significant figures forever.
Or not.
Or not. But it is an interesting, it's our sort of way. So it is, but I also think it's an elegant answer to it. There are only 2 words.
It's an important discussion, though. Because 0.96 is one thing, 0.51 is a different thing.
Well, let's see if you figure it's still 0.5.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and that's part of it, that in the rounding, I mean, if you think of it, if you look at the boundaries of numbers that are equivalent to 1, given rounding, your only, it goes from 0.96 up to 1.49. A lot goes on that other end.
So not to change the topic.
Oh,
Not to change the topic, but, and there were some hints regarding this earlier. What's the general sense, no promises I get, in terms of timing, both on the PFAS stuff, where I think you mentioned the fall, and the other stuff, which will be handled separately?
You do PFAS.
I'll do PFAS, which is that we're cutting it out and sending it on its merry way. So the schedule, even though it's a very small package now, it still has to go obviously through the various review and approval steps. And it's a small package, but it will be accompanied and come out with documentation in response to comments. And as you saw, we have a lot of comments. So that all has to be prepared as well. It's a bigger effort than the small number of changes would imply. But it's looking probably having a late fall. The schedule would have it be published maybe in early December of this year, and then would go into effect soon after that. And then the rest, yes, ma'am.
Well, I was
PFAS.
just gonna follow up on that. So, are you gonna tell us anything about how you're coming out in this review you're doing in the next couple months, or we have to,
You're gonna have another meeting?
Well, you mean specifically about PFAS?
yes.
There will be many more meetings about PFAS, but not specific to the waste site cleanup regs. The conversation will shift to the MCL development process, which we will participate in, and we welcome everybody. I know the LSP Association is willing and able and planning on participating in that. And like I said before, whatever comes out the other end of that process will reincorporate here as well, so we do want to be involved in that. And the extent to which I can kind of drop any bombs on what is coming up, previews, that's it, preview that, I would defer on the drinking water stuff. That has kind of far-ranging implications, and I want to keep a poker face on it. But something that's more specific to waste site cleanup and the NCP stuff, you're seeing that we received a lot of comments on the soil numbers, including consideration of background. The Vermont data came out, and there was actually some small background study down in Barnstable for a project that was going on down there. So we have that data as well for soil levels. And I think it's fair to say that kind of the sum of all of that would probably lead to a change in the soil numbers. And the direction would probably be up, somewhat higher.
I was surprised when you said I had assumed, I guess, wrongly, that water supply and waste site cleanup were sort of coordinating the discussion on PFAS, but you said earlier that there could be a situation where water supply came out with its numbers, waste site cleanup would go back and revise the MCP, which of course they'd have to do. But is there not good coordination between the two agencies?
Oh, we are so coordinated. Most of my meetings these days are PFAS meetings involving water supply and others. No, there's a lot of coordination going on, but the comments that we received on PFAS, we took all of those. They're on a shared drive that the water people have been looking at, and so for the toxicity part, the Office of Research and Standards, Mark Smith there is playing a vital role in both programs, working with all of us. There is a lot of coordination. We've shared all the information that we have. So what we come up with will be their starting point. But having said that, they have a process for setting MCLs, and they consider a variety of things that might be slightly different from what waste site cleanup looks at. Frankly, there are studies coming out about PFAS all the time. So, while coordination is happening and coordination will continue to happen, I don't want to say that, what we come up with is going to be it, the be all and end all, for the rest of the year, or for the next 5 years. They're going to go through their process, and they may well come out the other end with exactly the same approach. They may have new and different and interesting comments, or they may have to take into account other things, and they may come out with another different number or approach. They may have different chemicals, a whole bunch of different things that may happen. And then I would go back and look at waste site cleanup's long-term approach to GW1 numbers, which begins with if drinking water program has a standard or guideline, we adopt it as GW1 to have consistency. And only in the absence of one do we calculate them ourselves. So that's why, if they come up with something different, we'll change to be consistent again.
Well, no, it just makes me think, does it really make sense then to push forward with the PFAS changes first? I understand it's not gonna be way ahead, or at least you don't expect it's gonna be way ahead of everything else, but in light of the coordination that is going to be needed, and the possibility, as you just mentioned, of having to come back and revisit what you just did, potentially. I understand, I'm sure that, there's a lot of public pressure to move forward because PFAS is it's a charged thing right now, right? But I don't know, it just raises that question for me about whether it really makes sense for the department-wide, to move forward with PFAS-related amendments to the MCP when so much of what you're doing has to be correlated at some point with the drinking water program.
Yeah, it is something that we've been struggling with, and we've gone back and forth. It's not a nice, simple answer to it all. But certainly having notification criteria is very important, and the sooner we can have those, the better. Beyond that, for sites that are in the system, one way of looking at it is for a lot of these, particularly the ones we have now, and frankly, they're probably not going to close out in the next 6 months or a year. So it might be a moot point whether there are GWN standards or not. But to the extent that some sites might be on a path to close out, we do hear from the outside, the regulated community, that it would be good to have a number. And particularly in the absence of a drinking water standard, what we're looking at is that people always have the option of going to method 3. And under method 3, if there's a standard, that's applicable or relevant, it's an AR or applicable super analogous standard, we call it. But in the absence of one of those, then you go to the calculated values. So you're kind of in a calculated approach anyway. So making it clear that these are regulated entities, even though I've been saying it, we've all been saying it for a long time, it always helps to have it in the rules. It convinces our clients that yes, we have to pay attention to it. So we've been balancing all of it, and it is followed on. It's better to get these out, get them in the regs, because you don't, and another thing is you don't know what's going to happen later on, and that works in both ways.
By acting on the PFAS first, given the amount of sampling and analysis that's being done for water supplies, does that mean municipalities and private well owners that now have concentrations above reportable concentrations will now all become NCP sites? You're going to bring them all into the program by being out in front of it first?
Good question. There is well, like it or not, one way of looking at it is that all of those locations, whether they're municipal water supplies that have sampled and found PFAS or private wells that have sampled and found PFAS, they are, in fact, all 21 sites. There are releases the environment and chemicals that have come to be located at that. Luckily for the water suppliers, for instance, let's start there, we have a specific notification exemption so that while they are 21 sites, the water suppliers themselves have to notify and get an RTN and come into the waste cleanup program as long as they're dealing with our drinking water program. So that has been in place for a variety of chemicals that would equally apply to PFAS. Where water suppliers like us, from the waste cleanup side of things, is that it probably would be very rare that the water supplier themselves are the causally responsible party. That they're not the ones that put the PFAS in the water. So we have been working, we've been spending a lot of waste cleanup resources, particularly our regional staff and our contracting staff, backing out of the contaminated water supplies to find the potential sources and have other people take action. And there have been cases, there are sites where a PRP from 21E site, upgrading it from the source, has in fact funded the treatment system for a municipal water supply. So it's good to have it start, but essentially they have downgraded property status, if you like. We don't make them come into the system and file it, but that's one way of looking at it. They have the notification exemption. And for private wells, again, it's unlikely that private wells are causally responsible. So we have other cases where private well owners have come to us with sampling results. There was one that their sampling results were over 600 nanograms per liter, which our first reaction was, it's so hard to sample for PFAS.
Yeah, you do.
We'll go out and do it. And so we weren't panicking yet. We got like 7:30. But in that kind of circumstance, our approach is not to give them an RTN and say, good luck. It's really, we're asking the question, where should we be looking for potential source? And where should we now be sampling in the surrounding area for other people who may be having the same problem? So, yes, all of the sampling is going to lead to a lot of work for a lot of people. The Drinking Water Program, the Wayside Cleanup Program, the Office of Research and Standards, and others. But it's something that we don't think is worthwhile because of the potential exposures that we're out there. We really don't have a good handle on that yet. This will go a long way too.
And then the other part of the question.
So with respect to all the non-PFAS provisions, the hope is that we would have those changes internally done toward the end of November. We would like to hold, as I said, a couple of meetings, and I actually have a question for the group on that. So we have a meeting scheduled for the morning of October 15th. There's also the potential to have a different topic in the afternoon of that same day. I don't know, I'm seeing some no. That was my thought too.
You don't want to have too much fun at once.
That's true. But try to have those meetings in October and early November and have completed all of that. I think in October, we probably are not going to have a separate Wayside Cleanup Advisory Committee meeting because we have the Amherst Conference the week of the Advisory Committee. And in November, I think we're running into Thanksgiving. So we're going to use these meetings on the MCP revisions and ask you to participate in those. And then once we have that drafted internally, again, it has to go through our internal review process up to EEA and ANF. So, but that would start that review and finalization.
Do you think you'll have the response to comments posted before the October 15th meeting?
No.
Okay.
No, because we're going to be talking about some of those issues and how we might finalize them. But we are working on that, and some of the stuff is straightforward, and we've already drafted responses for that. So yeah, we'll have that available as well. So I think I mentioned we will post the written comments that we received very soon, and you can see those.
So just to take it another step, if your internal review starts November sometime, December, would you expect to publish them springtime, winter? Just by season?
I would hope it wouldn't extend into the springtime. Our internal process, can be a few months, but then from there it goes to Secretary of State, and it's just a matter of weeks before it gets published.
But as we go through that review and approval process, as it goes up, we also begin competing for people's attention for other rate packages from other programs, and you never know.
But I think the one of the messages is in splitting these things two things apart, it is not, don't take that to mean that we've slowed down on the MCP. It just means that we have two teams kind of focused on different aspects of this.
So I think we've experienced when you guys do your work and then it goes to what other great
people who are busier than we are.
Right. And if I remember, we have waited often months for it to kind of get through that logjam. So if you actually didn't take the PFAS changes out and kept them together, would that kind of create more urgency because of the general interest in PFAS?
That's a great question.
Good move, Liz.
Well, maybe we need to rewind the tape on that
Well,
one.
well,
I think
first,
it just ran out of battery.
First, I think you're beginning to scare me because I think sometimes we think alike. Second, luckily, this is not our decision. So,
Okay.
so clearly it was the best decision. And I think from our perspective, though, I mean, PFAS aside, everybody knows that's important to needs to be done, et cetera. We also don't want to give the impression that we're rushing the discussions and the issues that we have. We want to make sure that the subtlety of the language and the presence or absence of commas, they have big differences. And we don't want to give the impression that we are rushing the rest of the stuff just to keep up with PFAS. And we have some meetings, we want to have some discussions. We are going to change some of those proposed regulations. We're always committed to that, but we want to do it right and without an unacceptable time pressure. So I think it is a good decision to split them off.
Yes.
Nicely done.
One hopefully final question on timing. I think one of the biggest questions, and you indicated you had a lot of comments, were on the proposed exposure point, concentration, and risk assessment amendments, and whether there would be a different effective date or perhaps transition provision for sites that had already gone through phase 2 risk assessment. Are you able to offer any comment on whether that would be effective in the spring or some later time?
No.
Well, try.
I know, it's good.
Well, which is,
Try.
well, I mean, the good news, I think, is that, if I had a firm, decisive answer, the most likely one would be, well, what we wrote, we're just going to do. And we're not saying that that's set in stone. What we want to do is think about it. We want to have internal conversations within the senior staff and wayside cleanup, and then we have meetings where we want to talk to you about it. So it is not written in stone the way it was proposed. And thus, because it isn't, I can't answer. Or I can't give you anything other than that.
Okay.
All right, so October 15th,
Yes.
we'll be
And
here.
that's after the long weekend.
Is that
Yeah.
less than risk assessment, you think?